Hello book lovers, and welcome back or welcome to Nat Cat's Bookish Cafe. Today I am here to do my wrap up for the second half of October. Alright guys, so spooky season has come and gone, and it is time to review the books that I have read in the second half of the month. As always, if you would like to see what I read in the first half of the month, I will go ahead and link that up above and down below as well. In this video, I have 9 books to talk about, 7 books that I completed and 2 books that I DNF'd. But before we get into that, we'll go through my monthly basic stats. In the month of October, I ended up reading a total of 14 books. Page count wise, I believe it was the best of the year at 2,665 pages. As far as audiobook hours go, I listened to 52.57 hours worth of audiobooks. I have my star ratings here on this sheet of paper. I ended up getting 2 5-star ratings, which is really great because I think the month before I didn't get any. So I was really happy with that. I ended up getting 3 4.5 stars, 2 4 stars, 4 3.5 stars, 2 3 stars, and 1 2.5. I did DNF 3 books. 2 of those I did not rate. One of them I think I got about 74% through the audiobook, so I did rate it a 1 star, but I do believe I don't count that towards my annual rating. I know that doesn't make sense, but I don't count DNFs towards any of my other stats. So even if I'm petty and I decide to rate it on Goodreads, I don't really count it towards my stats. I don't DNF too much, so I don't think it would impact my overall statistics too much. And my average star rating for the month was a 3.86. Once again, lower than I would like. I always wanted to be above a 4-star average. This does mean that my annual average is just below 4 stars, and hopefully I get some really great ratings here in November and December to go ahead and just push that up the little bit that it needs to go to achieve that 4.0 average annual rating that I'm aiming for. All right, so usually when going into reviews, I like to start with the DNFs. So we'll go through those 2 first. The first I'm not really going to talk about. It is a nonfiction book that I wanted to read in October because it's about Dracula. And I read, I think, the prequel or the prologue, I should say, as well as the first part of chapter 1. And it was just too info dumpy for me. When it comes to nonfiction, I am very particular and I don't like it to be overly detailed because I'm not someone who can absorb little details. So when a book goes into too much detail about who's involved, how they're involved with each other, and dates and places and name, I can't do it. I'm not smart enough for it. My brain just can't absorb that information, and so it just seems like a waste of time for me to read this. Oh well, I'm not that interested in Dracula anyway. The second book that I DNF'd was an audiobook, the one that I mentioned earlier that I got 74% through it. So a bit of a bummer that I couldn't count any of that towards my stats because I definitely spent a few days on it, and that is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. So this was kind of a second chance author situation. I had read one of her books previously and did not enjoy it, but I've heard a lot of hype around this Gothic story where a socialite is called upon by her cousin to come to her new home because she feels that there is something weird going on there. But when she arrives, her cousin is kind of acting like everything is okay. She's obviously sick, but she's no longer kind of ranting about hearing voices. But our character decides to stay and starts experiencing weird dreams as well. My problem with this book is that I was very bored throughout the story. I found that the horror aspect didn't really do anything for me, despite the fact that it had kind of a nature aspect to it, and usually that works pretty well for me. But I just found that I didn't really connect to any of the characters, didn't connect to the story, and I was going to kind of push through it and just finish it, but it got to a scene that was what I consider a bit of like a sexual assault kind of situation, and sexual assault isn't always a trigger for me. And when I say sexual assault, I don't mean like full-blown rape or anything, but I can mean things like taking control of someone's body or making it so they can't control their body anymore, and touching them in ways that they shouldn't, or forcing them to undress in front of you. Things like that, that's what I'm talking about, and that happened like a couple times throughout the story, and it definitely is a part of the horror aspect of the story. It's a little hard to explain. Like I mentioned, sexual assault isn't really a trigger for me usually, but sometimes if it is just the part of the story that really sticks out the most because the story to me doesn't have anything else going on, then it just makes me feel uncomfortable, and not in like a horror aspect kind of way, but just like in a dirty, gross kind of way. And that's how the story made me feel. It made me feel really gross, and so I ended up just pausing it right in the middle of the scene, didn't finish the chapter or anything, and decided to put it down and just not pick it up. Personal preferences for me. Obviously, different people can handle different situations better or worse than other people. All right, getting into the books that I actually finished, we are going to start with Authority by Jeff Vandermeer. This is the second book to Annihilation, and I will say that I probably shouldn't have waited over a year to get into this book. I think I would have gotten a lot more out of it if I had read Authority more recently. In this story, we are following the after effects of the 12th expedition that we follow in book 1. We are following a different narrator. This narrator goes by the name of Control. He does have an actual name, but he uses Control throughout the majority of the book, so I have to admit I don't remember what his actual name is, but he is assigned to go to Southern Reach, and Southern Reach is the government facility that oversees Area X, and he's supposed to go in there and kind of investigate because the previous director had gone with the 12th expedition and has not returned. Might be a bit of a spoiler to say that, apologies. But this man is usually someone who kind of infiltrates terrorist organizations to kind of figure out their plan. He has bounced around the government quite a lot due to his mother, as well as some mistakes that he has made in the past, making it difficult for him to kind of find his footing in any organization. He definitely meets a lot of resistance while he gets there. The director's assistant, I don't think she's an assistant, I'm just going to refer to her as an assistant, but she is not happy to have him there. She fully believes that the director is going to return, and she's trying to keep things at Southern Reach the same and prepared for the director's return, and is kind of pushing against his investigation into what is going on here. We just kind of follow him as he learns more about previous expeditions, as he talks to the biologist who was the narrator in the previous story, and starts to form like an unusual connection to her, and he also talks to some of the other people that are working at Southern Reach. The story is one that kind of like gradually gets stranger and stranger, as it seems as if Area X is starting to make its way into Southern Reach, as well as the people working there. I ended up only giving this book 3 stars. I will say I think I was in a bit of a reading slump while I was reading it. It took me quite a while. I think it took me about 8 days to get through this book, despite it only being around 350 pages. I did not enjoy it quite as much as Annihilation. This felt more like a psychological horror rather than a psychological horror mixed with nature horror. I find that I don't have too much to say about this book. I felt like a lot of the time I was just kind of reading it and going with the flow and maybe not taking so much from it. I will say that I really enjoyed the ending of the story, and it definitely got me intrigued and excited for book 3, so I will definitely be continuing this series. But this book very much felt like a bridge book, so it's definitely suffering from second book syndrome, and because of that it got a bit of a lower rating. The next book that I finished was The Reek by Lily Mayne. This is part of her Monstrous series, the first being Soul Eater. In this book, we are following the Reek as well as Ghost, who is a raider. These stories take place in a post-apocalyptic America. About 20 years ago, a rift was created between our world and the world that these monsters come from, and the monsters, very eager to explore this new land, kind of rushed into our world, and our military's reaction was to try to destroy them. And in their eagerness to do that, they ended up destroying a lot of the world as well. At this time, most people are either living in overcrowded walled cities that are under the military's control. They are either soldiers in military bases, or they have decided to try their luck in the wastes by becoming raiders. At the beginning of the story, Ghost and one of his friends are off scavenging for some equipment at a building that had once belonged to the government but had fallen to ruin at some point. There they find the Reek. He is very injured and seems to be very scared, maybe a bit confused, not really communicating too well, and they decide to bring him back to their camp. Their camp, for the most part, is pretty open to monsters. I guess in the past they've healed monsters in their camp, though usually it was like smaller, more animal-like monsters than like a human, so it definitely causes a little bit of a divide between the members of the raider camp. But Ghost feels very attached and very attracted to our Reek, who later goes by the name One, so they allow him to stay. I'm not going to go too much else into the plot because I feel like it could be a little spoilery. One of the things I will say is, first of all, I gave this 4 stars. So far I will say it is my least favorite of the series. I will say the main reason for that had to do a little bit with my expectations, as well as the way that the book was plotted. Expectation wise, I ended up choosing this book for a Bookopoly prompt, actually, with revenge in mind. And while there's definitely some very good revenge in this story, it didn't happen until like maybe the last quarter of the story, and it ended up being a lot sweeter of a story than I was kind of looking for when I went into it. So I think I was a little disappointed by the sweetness when it came to this romance. I don't know if I mentioned that this is a male monster romance. The other part was plot-wise. So throughout the series, there seems to be the beginnings of an overarching plot, a bigger enemy kind of looming overhead, and I felt like this book spent too much time setting up for that instead of focusing on the actual couple. And I just felt like that took me out of the story a little bit, because I found myself kind of looking forward to reading the next books in the series, but then not really settling in this story because I was constantly thinking ahead instead of being in the moment with these characters. But other than that, I really did think that the characters were sweet, and even though that wasn't 100% what I was looking for, I did still enjoy their romance, and the smut, as always, with Lily Mayne was excellent as well. Next book I finished was Hell Followed With Us by Andrew Joseph White. I will say that this book and the Reek were in a vlog that I did, so if you want deeper thoughts on either of these books, definitely go check that out, especially this one. I'm not going to go too deep into my thoughts on this in this review, or I'll be standing here too long. But in this book, we are following Benji, who is a 16-year-old trans boy who is trying to escape the cult that he is technically a part of. We are about 2 years into the end of the world. About 2 years ago, his cult released a plague known as the Rot, which destroyed the majority of humanity. This cult is incredibly religious, and Benji was infected with this Rot in a very specific way, which instead of turning into some sort of monster or dying, which is what usually happens to people, he now encompasses Seraph, which is a being that his cult worships. He is running away because he does not want Seraph in their hands, and he doesn't want to be in their hands either. But unfortunately for him, they catch up with him and are starting to drag him back to their compound, and that is when he is rescued by a group of queer teens. These teens are seeking shelter in a queer community center, and one of their leaders, or one of their protectors, Nick, knows what Benji is, but is telling Benji that he needs to not tell that to the other people there and just pretend that he was a prisoner of this cult that they rescued. From there, Benji starts to kind of experience what it's like to be in a community that accepts him. He finds people that he wants to protect, so rather than taking up their offer to get out of town and run, he decides to stand up and fight and take down this cult. This book is YA, but it is incredibly gory. So if you don't like gore, don't read this book, because there's going to be a lot of gore throughout this entire book. It's definitely very gruesome. That was an aspect of the story I quite enjoyed, seeing as I had just finished the Reek and had been hoping for a bit more gore. I definitely got it in this book. I also really enjoyed the discussions that this book had about religion, homophobia within the queer community, the dangers of extremist religion, as well as its comparisons of a plague to the transphobic laws that are occurring within our country. I think this is one of those books where it starts off with a bang, and pacing wise, I thought it was relatively good for 90% of the book. I did think that in the end, it did take like a little bit too long for things to get where they needed to be. It was kind of like, oh, we're almost there, and oh, now there's another obstacle, and oh, we're almost there, and another obstacle kind of situation, where I just felt like the author was maybe dragging it out a little bit longer than they had to. But otherwise, I had a great time with the story. I definitely think it's a queer YA story that people should pick up. It is own voices when it comes to trans representation. Up next, I finished an audiobook called Murder and Mammon by Mia Manasala. This is the 4th book in the, is it Tita Rosie's Kitchen? Is that correct? This is kind of a cozy mystery story where we are following a woman whose name I do not remember right now, but she and her family seem to continuously get involved in murder mysteries. And in this book, one of the family friends, her daughter comes to visit and ends up being killed. So our character Lila is on the job again. One of the reasons is that unfortunately the police force in this area seems not to be very competent, so they often take it on themselves to help their friends and family get justice. I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. I have to admit, I don't have too much to say about it when it comes to these mysteries. They're just a good, easy time. I was feeling a bit slumpy with my audiobooks, and I was able to pick this one up and just sit back, relax, listen to it, enjoy the mystery aspect of it, all the yummy food descriptions. I enjoy the family relationships, the drama that occurs throughout the story between the family and the other members of the community. I also enjoyed the romance that is occurring. It's not a big part of the story or anything, but our character's now officially in an actual relationship, so there's no more love triangles occurring or anything like that. So I did enjoy that aspect. Overall, if there's more books in the series, I will definitely be checking them out, but I don't have any wild thoughts about them or anything like that. My last physical read of the month was The Haunting of Ashburn House by Darcy Coates. This was my first experience with Darcy Coates, and I think also my first experience with something that's kind of branded as cozy horror. I will say that cozy horror wise, I mean, I don't know what to expect. I can definitely see to a degree why this would be considered a cozy horror. You're sitting by the fireplace with your cat on the lap kind of situation while a ghost is torturing you, kind of, or tormenting you, not torturing you, but tormenting you kind of situation. But overall, I feel like it definitely leaned a bit more towards haunted house horror situation. I will say I thought that this book was relatively creepy and scary at times, but other times it kind of jumped a little bit into cheesy, especially when it came to who the villain was. I don't know if I felt like it was just overdone or what, but sometimes I was just like rolling my eyes a little bit when it came to the villain. But I did really like the cat that was in the story. I had to give the book extra credit for the role that he played. He was a wonderful character. I also did, for the most part, like our character. She was always like, okay, you know what, we're not gonna be like one of those girls in the horror movies or anything like that. But sometimes you just, no matter how hard you try, you find yourself in not the best situations. But I did enjoy the fact that our character wasn't like dumb or anything. I mean, sometimes she didn't make the smartest moves, but she was trying her best, and I can appreciate that. So I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. I definitely would consider trying Darcy Coates again. I feel like looking through her backlog, there is a ton, and she seems to do a lot of haunted house stuff. And when it comes to haunted house books, I don't know, there's not too much you can do with a scenario like that, I personally feel, so it may be a bit overdone, but I definitely think that if given the opportunity, I would read her again, because it was definitely a spooky, ooky time, perfect for reading around Halloween. And I totally realized I didn't give a synopsis about this book. Pretty much we just have a girl who is down on her luck, and she inherits this house, and when she shows up, there is a lot of rumors around that house coming from the villagers, because it seems that the family was massacred in there many years ago, and the murderer was never found. She's trying to kind of enjoy the free real estate kind of situation, but once she starts getting haunted by something in this house, it's very difficult to do that. Up next, I reread a book, and that is Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. This is a book I read a few years ago. I don't even remember when, but definitely before I started my YouTube journey. And I read it physically, and according to my Goodreads, I rated it 5 stars back then, which just makes me sometimes question my brain, because for some reason, whenever I think back on this book, I'm like, I don't remember it being 5-star material. I mean, I know I was throwing out 5 stars a lot more easily back then, but I went into this book thinking it would be maybe like a 3.5 or a 4-star. Wrong. I gave it 5 stars again. I will say that even though I don't remember much about my first experience reading it, I do think reading it as an audiobook was better. So maybe if I had read it physically, I would have given it a 4.5, but as an audiobook, 5-star material for sure. This book was a great cleanse for all the horror and gore and stuff that I had been reading throughout the month. It was funny, it was sexy, it was sweet, it was so adorable at times. I was just like loving every moment of it, and I was like, brain, why did you make me think that I didn't like this book? That's amazing. It's so worth the hype that it gets. Am I happy that this is one of the very few queer books that actually gets talked about on, like, you know, TikTok and big platforms? No, but I do think it definitely deserves to be on those platforms. In case you don't know what this book is about, we are following Henry and Alex, and Alex is the son of the first female president of the United States, and Henry is the second prince of the English royal family. Alex had a bad encounter with Henry many years ago, and so he is constantly poking and prodding at Henry every time that they meet. And one day he goes too far, and he and Henry end up having a big scandal after they destroy a like $75,000 wedding cake. And so the families decide that the two of them are going to pretend to be best friends instead of enemies, and as they spend more time together, they fall in love, and it's wonderful. There are many things to enjoy in the story outside of the romance. I really love Alex's relationship with his sister and his friends. I just think that the group that Henry and Alex form around them is such a fun gang to read about. Of course, I also enjoyed the slight political aspects of the story. Alex is wanting to go into politics, and he's realizing the fact that he is queer, and him living as an openly queer person could interfere with his success as a politician, which kind of shows that there is still a lot of homophobia in this country. So kind of watching him on that journey of reevaluating his life after he spent so many years set on doing this one thing, and everything that he's done in his life has kind of led him to this one thing, and suddenly that's all blown up, and he's realizing maybe that's not what would have been best for him anyway. I always enjoy kind of that trope of people reevaluating their lives and realizing that their passions maybe lie elsewhere, or that their talents will be more beneficial in other areas of society. So great all-around story. Really glad that I had decided to reread that and kind of re-spark my love for the story. I have not watched the movie yet. I suck at watching movies, at watching TV shows that I want to watch, but I do have Prime, and I believe that's on there, so I'll get around to it eventually, hopefully. And for the final book of the month, I actually finished Red, White, and Royal Blue and this book both on the last day of the month, and that is Camp Damascus by Chuck Tingle. I had actually listened to the first 25% of this book, had like a panic attack because it was like creeping me out and stressing me out so much that I actually had to put it down and then read Red, White, and Royal Blue to just like calm down a little bit. And then I picked up and listened to the last 75% of it on the last day of the month with no more panic attacks. Doesn't mean that the book wasn't creepy throughout the rest of the story. In this book, we are following a girl who lives in a community that is best known for its very successful conversion camp. This is a camp that is run by a religious organization that makes people not queer anymore, which our character never really saw as a problem because she's very immersed in her religion. But as she starts to realize that she may be a lesbian, it does become a little bit more of a problem, especially when it seems that some sort of demon that may be working at that camp is stalking her. So I don't want to say too much more about this book. The synopsis was so vague, and honestly, I had no idea what to expect going into the story, and I think that added a lot to the book because I was constantly like, I don't know what's gonna happen, I don't know what the purpose of this book is. It's stressing me out. I'm sweating. I was sweating. I will say that if you really enjoy stories that involve both religion and queerness, this story definitely has it. This story has a lot of religious references. I am not religious. Usually those references don't mean anything. And personally for me, they add to the horror aspect because I see many forms of religion as very dangerous. I see them as a threat. I do know that there are good forms of religion, but the religion in the story is not one of them, and so that makes me very nervous for our character. I will say that I really enjoyed our character's journey, but I also liked watching her journey alongside a friend of hers because obviously the both of them were raised religious and then saw that their religion sought to hurt them, and they kind of went in different directions on if they decided to leave their religion behind or if they decided to take their religion and turn it into something that was loving and accepting and gave them peace while simultaneously still worshiping their God. So I do like the fact that the story addressed the fact that you can be queer and you can still be very devoted to your God, because I do think that a lot of people in this world experience that. So it's very important to discuss it in the story and not just be like, hey, if you're queer, you have to give up religion because it hates your community. There are a lot of religious people and religious organizations that do love the queer community and accept them. So really glad that that was mentioned in the story. Horror wise, it was creepy. There was some body horror aspects that definitely got to me and it gave me the EBGBs for sure. I ended up giving this book 4.5 stars. I highly recommend reading it. Just trust me. I know I'm not saying too much about the book and it might sound kind of vague, but it is an excellent read, and going into it knowing as little as possible I think is the best possible way. This is an adult book. I think one of the reasons I took off half a star because it did feel a little bit like a YA horror. I will say it was relatively creepy, but our character was just graduating high school despite being 20 because of her religious organization taking 2 years to, I think, just like focus on a religious text and stuff, and so they usually graduate a couple years later than your average US citizen. So I would say if you read this and are hoping for an adult horror, you might not get it, especially if you're familiar with other adult horrors. If you're usually doing YA horror and looking to transition to adult horror, I think this would be a good opportunity. All right, guys, so those are all the books that I read or DNF'd in the second half of the month. I would love to know your opinion on any of these books, as well as what your favorite and least favorite of the month was. I have to admit, going into this video, I did not think about what my favorite or least favorite is. I do know that I gave, I believe it was volume 6 of Perfect World, 2.5 stars. So this would be my least favorite book that I didn't DNF. And between my 2 5-star books, which was The Push by Ashley Audrain and Red, White, and Royal Blue, they're so different. They're so different, but I think that I will have to go, this is impossible, because I was gonna say The Push was more addictive, but I also really didn't want to put down Red, White, and Royal Blue. I'm gonna go with The Push just because Red, White, and Royal Blue was a reread, and while I really enjoyed it, The Push was a 5-star for a new book that I've never experienced before, so it was even more impactful than my enjoyment of Red, White, and Royal Blue. So least favorite and favorite of the month, and I'd love to see yours down below. As always, thank you so much for supporting my channel by watching my videos, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!